The first thing Silas Cain noticed was the laughter. It rolled across the dusty auction yard like thunder, loud and careless. The kind of laughter men make when they think nothing in the world matters except the show in front of them. Silas stood at the back rail with his hands in his pockets, dust drying in his throat, trying to ignore the noise. He had not come to town for entertainment. His ranch needed horses, and a man whose cattle depended on him did not have the luxury of wasting time. Two of his best horses had gone lame the same week. Without replacements, he could not move the herd to summer pasture, and without that pasture, the cattle would thin out before winter ever arrived. So he stood there among men he barely liked, waiting for something he could afford. The auctioneer slammed his hand against the wooden rail. "Next lot. 2 bay geldings. Sound enough if you ain't picky." The horses were led into the ring. Their ribs showed through dull coats, and their tails flicked slowly at flies. They had clearly not been treated well, but Silas studied their legs carefully. Strong joints, clear eyes, no limp. That was enough for him. "I'll start at $12, the auctioneer shouted. A hand near the front lifted. "12, another voice called out. "13. The bidding crawled slowly upward. Most of the men present were not interested in skinny horses during a dry summer. Feed was expensive, and every dollar mattered. But Silas waited. Patience had been beaten into him by a lifetime of ranch work and the quiet lessons of his parents. You did not rush decisions when the difference between surviving and losing everything was sometimes only a few dollars. 14, someone called. 14.5. The bidding slowed. Heads shook. A rancher near the gate spat into the dirt and walked away. Silas raised his hand. 15, he said. The auctioneer pointed. 15 from the man in the back. "Oh, do I hear 16? No one spoke. The crowd shifted quietly. Going once. Silas did not move. Going twice. The hammer came down. Sold. Silas exhaled slowly. $15 was almost everything he had left, but the horses would work. They had to. Then the auctioneer grinned. It was not a friendly grin. It was the kind of grin that meant trouble. He jerked his chin toward the far end of the ring. "And hell," he said loudly. "Take the woman too. She comes with the lot." The yard exploded with laughter. Silas frowned. "What?" The crowd parted slightly, and 2 handlers dragged something forward behind the horses. A woman. Her wrists were tied with thick rope. She stumbled barefoot across the dirt, nearly falling before catching herself. Her dress was torn and stained with dust. Dark hair hung in tangled strands across her face. She stood behind the horses with her head lowered, perfectly still, or like someone who had learned that moving only made things worse. The auctioneer shrugged. "Came with the stock shipment. No papers, no name. Can't sell her separate. Take her or leave her." More laughter spread through the yard. A man near the front leaned against the rail. "Probably dumber than the horses." Another voice shouted something crude. Silas felt something inside his chest tighten. "I didn't buy a woman," he said flatly. "Didn't charge you for one either," the auctioneer replied. "Consider it a bonus." Before Silas could answer, another voice cut through the noise. "I'll take her." Silas turned. Virgil Creed pushed away from the fence 2 rails down. Everyone knew Creed. He was the kind of man whose name made people quiet when it was spoken. Big, thick around the middle, with eyes that lingered too long on things that did not belong to him. Silas had seen women disappear from town after being seen with Creed. Creed smiled slowly. "I'll give you $2 for the trouble." The laughter softened into something uglier. The woman had not moved once. But Silas noticed one small detail. Her fingers curled tightly into fists. It was the only sign of life she had shown. Silas stepped forward. Untie her. The yard went silent. Creed blinked. Now hold on. I said untie her. Silas did not raise his voice. He simply stood there and waited. The auctioneer looked between the two men. Then he shrugged. Cut the rope. A young boy stepped forward and sliced through the bindings. The rope fell away. For a moment the woman swayed like she might collapse. Her hand shot out and grabbed the mane of the nearest horse to steady herself. Creed scowled. This is foolish, Cain, he said. Silas ignored him. He took the horse's reins and walked out through the gate. Just behind him, he heard the faint sound of bare feet following. They walked in silence for nearly a quarter mile before Silas stopped. The noise of the auction had faded behind them. Dust drifted quietly through the summer air. He turned around. She stood about 6 feet away, head lowered, arms at her sides, waiting. You don't have to follow me, Silas said. No answer. I didn't buy you, he continued. I bought 2 horses. Still nothing. Silas studied her carefully. Her hands were scraped and raw, but the shape of them caught his attention. Long fingers, fine bones, not the hands of someone who had grown up doing hard labor. Can you talk? He asked. Silence. Silas sighed. All right, he said. I've got a ranch about 4 hours east. But you can stay the night. Eat something. Tomorrow you can go wherever you want. For the first time she moved. She lifted her head slightly. Her eyes met his. Dark. Sharp. Watching him carefully like a person measuring something important. Then she lowered her gaze again and stepped forward. Silas turned back to the road. All right then. The walk home took most of the afternoon. The summer sun hung low and cruel in the sky. Dry grass stretched across the land in faded yellow waves, and the horses plodded steadily. Behind him, the woman walked without complaint, barefoot, step for step beside the horses. Not once did she stumble. Not once did she ask to stop. By the time the ranch came into view, Silas had looked back at her at least 20 times. She never spoke, never asked a question, never made a sound. The ranch itself was small, a weathered house, a crooked corral, a barn leaning slightly to one side. Silas led the horses to the trough and pointed toward the bunkhouse. Water's in the barrel by the door, he said. There's a stove inside. She walked past him without speaking, stepped into the bunkhouse, closed the door. Silas stood there staring at it for a long moment. Then he went to the house and put together a plate of bread, beans, and dried beef. He carried it back and knocked once. Food's here. No reply. He left the plate on the step. And that night, he sat at his kitchen table trying to eat. But he could not stop thinking about the auction yard, the rope, the laughter, Creed's eyes, and the way her hands had clenched. A knock came at the door. Silas opened it. She stood there holding the empty plate. He took it. Thank you, he said quietly. She nodded once and turned away. The bunkhouse door clicked shut behind her. Silas washed the plate slowly. Every scrap of food was gone. Even the beans. He woke before sunrise. It was habit more than anything. But when he stepped outside, he stopped. The bunkhouse door stood open. The woman was crouched beside the corral fence. She had found a hammer somewhere and was fixing a loose board. Each strike was careful, measured, precise. Silas walked over. You don't have to do that. She drove one more nail. Then she set the hammer down. For the first time, she spoke. God, the bottom hinge on your barn door is rusted through, she said calmly. It will break within the week. Silas stared at her. You talk. Yes. They said you couldn't. They said many things. Her voice was steady, educated. nothing like the broken silence she had shown at the auction. Silas crouched beside her. "You let them believe you were worthless." She looked at him. "A woman who cannot speak is invisible," she said. "And invisible people survive." Silas absorbed that slowly. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered. "Ruth." She held his gaze firmly. "Ruth Callaway." Silas tipped his hat. "Silas Cain." For the first time since the auction yard, something close to a smile touched the corner of her mouth, and neither of them yet understood that the quiet moment beside a broken fence was the beginning of a war that would tear down the most powerful man in the territory. But morning light spread slowly across the Cain ranch, turning the dry fields gold as the sun climbed over the hills. Silas leaned against the corral fence, watching Ruth work. She moved with quiet focus, brushing one of the bay horses he had bought at the auction. The animal stood calm beneath her hands, ears flicking lazily. "You know horses," Silas said. Ruth finished checking the horse's hoof before answering. "I know many things men don't expect me to know." She straightened and wiped dust from her hands. "We need to talk." Silas rested his arms on the fence. "About what?" "About Helena." Silas frowned slightly. Helena was the territorial capital, 4 long days away by horse. Ranchers went there only when something serious needed settling. "And why are we talking about Helena?" he asked. Ruth crossed her arms and looked out over the fields. "God, because the men who sold me at that auction were working for my father." Silas went still. "Your father?" "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Harlon Mercer." The name hit Silas like a hammer. Everyone in the territory knew Mercer. Mercer Land and Rail had swallowed half the small ranches in Montana. Men said Mercer could move survey lines, buy judges, and take land without ever touching a shovel. Silas's jaw tightened. "Mercer stole my father's south pasture," he said slowly. Ruth nodded once. "I know." The silence that followed was heavy. "How?" Silas asked. Ruth stepped closer. "Because I saw the papers." She spoke calmly, but her hands trembled slightly. "My father built his empire by changing survey records. Land markers moved a few yards. Titles rewritten. Of families forced into debt they could not escape." She paused. "Your ranch was one of them." Silas felt heat rise in his chest. "My father missed payments," he said. "That's what the bank said." Ruth shook her head. "No, your cattle were poisoned." Silas stared at her. "What?" 40 head died that winter," she said. "Your father could not pay the loan after that. Mercer filed foreclosure 2 months later." Silas felt the world tilt. "How do you know that?" "I read the letter ordering it." Silas gripped the fence so hard the wood creaked. "My father spent the rest of his life thinking he failed," he said quietly. Ruth lowered her voice. "He didn't fail. He was robbed." Silas said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked the question that mattered. "Why tell me this now?" Ruth's expression hardened. Because I copied every document I could before my father discovered what I was doing." Silas looked at her carefully. "You have proof?" Ruth tapped her temple. "In here. You memorized it. Every name, every survey number, every bribe." Silas let out a slow breath. "Ruth," he said quietly, "men get killed over things like that." "I know." She stepped closer. "That is why I need to reach Helena." Silas frowned. "Cheb, the Territorial Records Office. If we enter those documents into the federal record, Mercer cannot bury them. And if we don't?" Ruth met his eyes. "He wins." The wind rustled through the dry grass around them. Silas looked out over his ranch. The crooked corral. The leaning barn. the land his mother had fought to keep until the day she died. Then he looked back at Ruth. "When do we leave?" Ruth blinked. "You're coming?" Silas gave a small, humorless smile. "Lady, but your father already ruined my family once. Seems only fair I return the favor." Something softened in Ruth's expression. "All right," she said. "We ride tomorrow." They spent the afternoon preparing. Silas packed food, ammunition, and water. Ruth studied the maps he kept rolled in a drawer. Her eyes moved quickly across the paper, memorizing routes. "There are Mercer checkpoints on the main road," she said. "So, you know that how?" 7 months of being transported like cargo. Silas glanced at her. "You remember everything." "I had nothing else to do." By sunset, they had 2 horses ready and supplies tied down. They slept lightly that night. Both of them understood what the ride meant. Once they left the ranch, there was no turning back. They were in the saddle before sunrise. The land stretched wide and empty ahead of them. For several hours they rode without speaking, and the rhythm of hooves filled the silence. Around midday, Ruth suddenly raised her hand. "Stop!" Silas reined in. "What is it?" She pointed toward a distant ridge. A thin cloud of dust rose against the sky. "Riders." Silas narrowed his eyes. "How many?" 3, maybe 4. "They following us?" "Yes." Silas swore quietly. That didn't take long. "They probably wired Mercer last night." Silas checked the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Think they'll shoot?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm worth more alive." Silas looked at her. "That comforting?" "Not particularly." The dust cloud grew larger. "They're gaining," Silas said. Ruth studied the terrain. "There's a ravine half a mile south." "We lose them there?" "We try." Silas nodded. "Then let's ride." They kicked their horses into a hard gallop. The wind rushed past them as the ravine opened ahead. Loose rock made the descent dangerous, but Ruth guided her horse carefully down the narrow path. The riders behind them slowed. "They won't risk breaking horses in there," Ruth said. They rode along the ravine floor until the dust cloud disappeared from sight. When they climbed out the other side, the pursuers were gone. For now. Silas let out a breath. "You're good at this." "I learned by surviving." They stopped near a small spring to water the horses. Silas knelt beside the water and splashed his face. Then Ruth spoke again. "There's something else you should know." Silas looked up. "What now?" "My father didn't just steal land." She hesitated. "He had people killed." Silas felt his stomach tighten. "Ranchers who refused to sell," she continued. "Men who fought back. Accidents happened." She looked directly at him. "Your father was one of them." Silas's hands curled into fists. "Mercer had your cattle poisoned so the foreclosure could happen," Ruth said quietly. Silas closed his eyes. For years he had blamed his father. Blamed weakness. Blamed failure. Now the truth stood in front of him like a loaded gun. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Then we ride faster." They pushed through the afternoon and into evening. The Bitterroot Mountains rose ahead like dark shadows against the sky. Ruth guided them along narrow paths that avoided the main trails. "You've been through here before," Silas said. "Yes." "As a prisoner." "Exactly." They made camp under a cluster of cottonwood trees. No fire. Too visible. They ate in silence. After a while, Ruth spoke quietly. "Tell me about your mother." Silas leaned back against his saddle. "Margaret Cain," he said. "Toughest woman I ever knew." He stared up at the stars. "She ran this ranch after my father died, but worked herself to death keeping it alive." "How old was she?" 42. Ruth looked down at her hands. "My mother died when I was 12, she said softly. "Fever." Silas nodded. The silence between them felt different now, less guarded. Finally, Ruth lay back against her saddle. "We should sleep." "You first." She studied him. "You trust me?" Silas shrugged. "You memorized an empire's secrets just to destroy it." He smiled slightly. "Oh, that seems trustworthy enough." Ruth almost smiled. Within minutes, she was asleep. Silas stayed awake, rifle across his knees. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. For the first time in years, the anger inside him had direction. Mercer had stolen land, stolen lives, stolen his father's dignity. But Mercer had made one mistake. He had thrown his daughter away. And that daughter now knew every secret he had. Silas looked over at Ruth, sleeping beside the saddle. "Yes, tomorrow," he murmured quietly. "Tomorrow, we start taking it back." The coyote's scream came just before dawn. Silas's eyes opened instantly. Across the small camp, Ruth was already sitting up. Her hand rested on the handle of the revolver Silas had given her the day before. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Silas nodded. But it wasn't the coyote that worried him. It was the sound that followed. Hooves. Slow. Careful. Coming through the dark hills behind them. Ruth listened for a moment, her head tilted. "2 riders," she said quietly. "Maybe 3. Silas stood and began saddling the horses. "They found us." "They never lost us," Ruth replied. They packed quickly. No wasted movement. No panic. Within minutes they were riding again, guiding the horses through the dim gray light of early morning. The Bitterroot Hills stretched around them like shadows. For a while the hoofbeats behind them faded. Then they returned. "Closer." Silas glanced over his shoulder. "They're stubborn." Ruth's voice stayed calm. "They're paid to be." They rode harder. The mountains slowly gave way to open land. In the distance, the first buildings of Helena appeared, small shapes rising from the valley floor. Silas felt hope stir in his chest. "How far?" 4 miles, Ruth said. Then she went still. Silas followed her gaze. 3 riders waited on the road ahead. One of them wore a marshal's badge that glinted in the morning sun. Ruth's voice turned cold. "Wade Pruitt." Silas frowned. "Who?" "My father's fixer." The riders behind them were closing fast. They were trapped. Pruitt rode forward slowly, his horse stepping into the center of the road. "Well now," he called calmly. "Miss Mercer." Ruth didn't answer. Pruitt's eyes slid to Silas. "You must be Cain." Silas said nothing. Pruitt rested his hand on his pistol. "You're harboring a fugitive," he said. "Got a warrant?" Silas asked. Pruitt smiled slightly. "I'm a United States Marshal." "That ain't what I asked." The smile faded. Ruth leaned forward in her saddle. "We don't have time for this," she whispered. Silas nodded slightly. Then he spoke quietly. "When I say go, you ride." Ruth's eyes widened. "Silas, just ride." Pruitt lifted his voice. "Last chance, Cain. Hand over the woman." Silas kicked his horse forward suddenly. The movement startled Pruitt's horse. At the same moment, Silas shouted, "Go!" Ruth didn't hesitate, while her horse burst forward and shot past the line of riders before they could react. Pruitt swore and wheeled his horse. One of his men chased after her. Silas blocked the road. Pruitt raised his pistol. "Move." Silas didn't. "Shoot me in front of the whole valley," Silas said calmly. "Let's see how that plays in court." Pruitt hesitated. That moment was enough. Ruth disappeared down the road toward Helena. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "You're a dead man, Cain!" Silas spat blood into the dirt. "Maybe." Pruitt swung the pistol. The metal smashed into Silas's face. Pain exploded through his skull. He nearly fell from the saddle. Pruitt struck him again. Stars burst behind Silas's eyes. "You think you're a hero?" Pruitt asked quietly. Silas tasted blood. "My father lost land because of your boss," he said. Pruitt's expression flickered. "Your father lost land because he was weak." Silas smiled through the blood. "No," he said. "He lost it because Mercer poisoned his cattle." Pruitt's face went still. Silas leaned forward. "And now Mercer's daughter is riding into Helena with every dirty secret he ever wrote down." For a moment, Pruitt said nothing. Then he turned sharply. "Ride." The three men thundered toward Helena. Silas stayed where he was, barely upright in the saddle. Then he turned his horse and followed slowly. 2 minutes. That was all the time he had bought her. Ruth's horse was nearly finished. Foam streaked its neck as it ran through the streets of Helena. People scattered. Wagons swerved aside. Behind her, she could hear the riders coming. "Stop her!" someone shouted. Ruth ignored them. At the far end of the street, she saw the building she was searching for. A brass plate beside the door read, "Federal Court." She pulled the horse to a stop and ran up the steps. The door was locked. She pounded on it. "Judge Craddock!" No answer. Behind her, hooves thundered onto the street. Pruitt. Ruth struck the door again. "Judge Craddock, please!" The lock turned. The door opened. An older man in a vest and spectacles looked down at her in confusion. "Yes?" "My name is Ruth Mercer," she said breathlessly. "I have evidence of land fraud across this territory." She pointed down the street. "And a marshal coming to kill me before I can tell you about it." Judge Craddock looked past her. He saw Pruitt riding toward the building. "Inside," the judge said. Ruth stepped in. The door slammed shut. The bolt slid into place. Seconds later, Pruitt hit the door with his fist. "Open up!" Craddock remained calm. "What is it you wish, Marshal?" "That woman is under arrest." "For what charge?" "Theft." Craddock adjusted his glasses. "Do you have a warrant?" Silence. "No." "Then you have no authority here." Pruitt's voice hardened. "You're making a mistake." Craddock turned away. "Perhaps." Then he looked at Ruth. "Start talking." For 2 hours, Ruth spoke. Names, dates, land surveys, bribes, poisoned cattle. It burned records. Judge Craddock wrote everything down. When she finished, he leaned back slowly. "If this is true," he said quietly, "it will destroy your father." Ruth nodded. "That's the idea." Craddock stood and signed several documents. "I'm placing you under federal protection." Outside, Pruitt stopped pounding on the door. For the first time in 20 years, Harlon Mercer had reached a door he could not open. They found Silas outside town an hour later. A deputy brought him in on horseback. Ruth was waiting on the courthouse steps. She helped him down. "You look terrible," she said softly. "You should see the other guy," Silas muttered. The doctor cleaned his wounds while Ruth sat nearby. After the doctor left, the room grew quiet. "You made it," Silas said. "You gave me 2 minutes." "That's all?" "That's everything." Ruth reached across the table and took his hand. "Do you know what I thought at the auction?" she said quietly. Silas shook his head. "I thought my life was over." Her voice trembled. "And then you said 2 words. Silas knew the words. "Untie her." "You saw me," Ruth whispered. Silas squeezed her hand gently. "You were always there," he said. "I just refused to pretend you weren't." The hearing happened 3 days later. The courtroom filled with ranchers from across the territory. Ruth stood before them all. "My father stole 63 parcels of land," she said clearly. "And I can name everyone." The room erupted. Farmers stood. Widows cried. Men who had lost everything stared in shock. Judge Craddock raised the gavel. Order returned slowly. Ruth spoke for 2 hours. When she finished, the truth could no longer be buried. Mercer's empire cracked open like dry earth under rain. Months passed. Investigations spread across the territory. Survey records proved Ruth's testimony. Land was returned. Compensation funds created. And Harlon Mercer was indicted by a federal grand jury. One evening, long after the trials began, Silas stood beside the rebuilt corral. The barn had been rebuilt too. Stronger this time. Behind him, Ruth stepped onto the porch. "You're staring at that pasture again," she said. Silas smiled slightly. "I was thinking about my mother." Ruth walked beside him. "What about her?" "She used to say something every night after the books didn't balance." "What?" Silas looked across the land. "She'd close the ledger and say, 'Tomorrow we'll find a way.'" Ruth slipped her hand into his. "She was right." Silas nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "She was." He glanced at her. "You staying?" Ruth smiled. "I already told you." Silas squeezed her hand. The sun dipped low over the fields. The ranch was quiet again. Months earlier, she had been thrown in with 2 horses like something worthless. Now she stood beside the man who had refused to leave her tied. Together, they had done something no one believed possible. They had brought down an empire. And on the land Mercer once tried to steal, 2 stubborn people began building something stronger than money or power. A future.